There comes a moment in life when you suddenly notice just how much energy you've poured into explaining yourself. Not because someone demanded it, not because the situation required clarity, but because somewhere deep in your wiring, you learned that every feeling, every choice, every boundary needed a defense. You softened your truth, with reasons padded your no, with excuses, and wrapped your discomfort in explanations so no one would misunderstand you or withdraw their love. And the funny thing is, most people don't see this as fear. They see it as politeness, as being considerate, as being easy to deal with. But beneath that surface-level niceness lies a much older psychological pattern. Carl Jung would say it began long before adulthood, back when you were still figuring out who you were allowed to be. Many people grow up in environments where emotions weren't treated as real, valid experiences, but as inconveniences that needed to be minimized. Maybe you heard, "Don't make a big deal out of it," or "You're overreacting," or "Stop crying. It's not that serious." Maybe every feeling you had to come with a justification before anyone took you seriously. And what does a child learn from that? They learn that emotions are problems, not signals. They learn that inner truth is conditional. They learn that in order for their experience to matter, they must present evidence. This belief doesn't fade with age. It burrows in, quietly dictating how you speak, how you set boundaries, how you show up in relationships. By the time adulthood arrives, the habit is so seamlessly woven into your behavior that you barely notice it. You explain why you're tired, why you can't make it, why you need time alone, as if your existence requires context. You justify your decisions even when no one questions them, because over time you learn that being understood feels like being safe. So, you live from the outside in, watching people's reactions, adjusting your tone, preparing explanations before anyone has even reacted. And because of this constant performance, your identity becomes fragile. You start to evaluate yourself through the imagined eyes of others. If someone disapproves, you don't just question the decision, you question your worth. Slowly, almost invisibly, your inner authority fades, and the person you present becomes a careful construction rather than a confident truth. The cost of this is deeper than most people realize. Internally, you lose trust in your own instincts. Choices that once felt clear become clouded with doubt, because you're waiting for someone else to bless them. Anxiety creeps in because you are always managing perception, and that is an exhausting way to live. Your emotional world becomes something you monitor, edit, and curate rather than something you inhabit honestly. And when you're always trying to avoid misunderstanding, you end up misunderstanding yourself. In relationships, the cost becomes even more obvious. When you over-explain, you unintentionally train others to expect a justification for every boundary you set. Some people will use that dynamic to maintain control, because the more you justify, the more power they hold. Even well-meaning people may grow accustomed to you doing the emotional labor, smoothing the tension, filling the silence, offering context they never actually needed. Over time, one person becomes the feeler and the explainer. The other becomes the judge and the validator. And that imbalance erodes the foundations of connection. But sooner or later, something inside you reaches a breaking point, or more accurately, a waking point. You realize you don't have to keep doing this. You realize you can step back from the constant habit of justifying yourself. And that choice, even though it seems small, is a profound turning point. Choosing not to explain yourself isn't about shutting down or being distant. It's not a refusal to communicate or a strategy to avoid intimacy. It's simply the act of no longer defending your right to exist as you are. You say what you mean, without dressing it up. You express feelings plainly, without apology. You set boundaries with clean, uncluttered language. You allow your truth to stand on its own legs, instead of leaning on explanations for support. And when you do this, a deep internal shift begins. Suddenly you hear yourself saying things like, "No, that doesn't work for me, and you leave it at that. You let messages sit until you're ready, without sending a justification in the meantime. You change your mind without offering a multi-paragraph explanation. Your emotions move from arguments to be defended, to truths to be acknowledged. At first, the silence after a boundary feels loud, uncomfortable, unfamiliar, but soon you begin to feel the quiet strength in it. You start to realize that your feelings are valid simply because you feel them. You understand that being misunderstood is not a danger, but a part of life. You recognize that your boundaries do not require negotiation or approval to be real. Jung would say this is the heart of individuation, the process of becoming a fully integrated self, rather than a persona performing for acceptance. When you stop explaining yourself, you release the mask you created to make others comfortable. You begin to stand in your own life without leaning on their reactions for steadiness. This shift will absolutely change your relationships. The ones built on imbalance, guilt pressure, emotional dependency, tend to fall away. People who relied on your self-doubt lose access to that version of you. People who expected you to cushion every boundary suddenly find that the cushion is gone, but the relationships that survive, or the ones that form afterward, are rooted in mutual respect. They don't require explanation, and the transformation inside you. That is the real prize. Without the weight of explanations, your inner world becomes calmer. You feel less divided, less conflicted. You stop negotiating with yourself. You reclaim pieces of your personality you once hid or apologized for. The parts you used to justify become parts you simply accept. Your sense of self becomes clearer, not louder, not harsher, just more truthful. Life doesn't suddenly become easy. The challenges remain, the world keeps spinning the same way. But you change. You grow steadier, more grounded, anchored from within instead of swayed by every reaction or expectation. You become someone whose worth is no longer questioned, not by others and not by yourself. And it's in that inner shift that everything around you begins to transform. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop chasing approval, you stop checking the emotional weather before deciding how to exist. Instead, you start living from authenticity, simple, honest, unpolished truth. You no longer wait for permission. You trust your own compass. The performance falls away, and in its place comes a fuller, more genuine way of being. And if Jung were here, he'd likely smile and say, this is the moment a person finally steps into their real self, when they stop explaining and start becoming.